Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fall 2024 semester BIO110 Essentials of Anatomy and Physiology. Again, I am Dr. Gruwell. I will be your instructor for this semester. Before we jump all the way in, for our online asynchronous section, you will be responsible for all of your McGraw-Hill Connect activities or the graded activities that you see. There's some ungraded activities included as well. I highly recommend you doing those. There'll be some readings, some interactive kind of study tools. But even if it's not graded, doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. I also strongly encourage you to watch the McGraw-Hill Connect tutorial and introduction videos. We'll be using McGraw-Hill Connect quite frequently throughout the semester. A majority of our graded assignments are on McGraw-Hill Connect. For my in-person class, we will be doing these lectures in class, but I will also provide you these recorded lectures so that if you'd like to look back and rewatch something, that is available to you. So these are out of your book here. So the Seeley's Essentials of Anatomy and Physiology. There is a link in the course information module for the bookstore. So if you have not yet gotten the book, I would recommend it. You have access to the online Learning Connect through the book. So this is a class where you really do need to get the book so you can get that access. Okay, so let's start off. A really appropriate place to start is what is actually anatomy and physiology? So anatomy is an investigation of body structure. So the term anatomy really means to dissect or to separate and look at the individual parts that make up a whole. So in this case, we're referring to the individual parts that make up the human organism. So we can look at this all the way at a cellular level in the really tiny parts. We can also look at these as systems in our whole human organism. Some different types of anatomy study is regional anatomy, meaning someone that may specialize in, say, the head or the foot or the upper extremity. We have external anatomy or surface anatomy, the study of our external structures. We have anatomical imaging, stuff such as X-ray, MRI, CT scans, imaging that allows us to view our anatomy. So anatomy is really what is it? We're kind of dissecting the different parts and identifying what is making up this specific structure or organism. The second part of things is physiology, which is really the investigation of our processes and functions. So this is how our body works. So we need to understand the anatomy, the what it is, before we can understand the physiology or the how it works. So the example that I like to use to help illustrate the difference between anatomy and physiology is if I ask you to point to your kidney and you kind of point to your side in the back, that's where it is, that's what it is, that's anatomy. That's just the identification. Now, if I ask you how your kidney works to filter the blood, now we're talking about the physiology side of things. If I ask you how chronic kidney disease influences your kidney's ability to filter the blood, now we're talking about pathophysiology, or the application of physiology specific to a disease. So why is anatomy and physiology important? So it helps us to understand how our body responds to stimuli or different input. This includes environmental changes, so like the temperature changing from hot to cold, environmental cues, of course, diseases or that pathophysiology that we were talking about just a second ago. And it also allows you to understand how injuries affect the body. So not only is anatomy and physiology important for all of these reasons, but especially for those of you who plan to pursue a career in the healthcare field or related to healthcare, understanding anatomy and physiology is really the building block or the foundation for a lot of the advanced information and decision making that you'll learn throughout your kind of educational journey and career pathway. So really take the time to get a good grip on the building blocks or the basics of anatomy and physiology. Okay, we're going to talk about structure. Let me just make sure. Okay, I wanted to make sure we were recording there, guys. So we're going to talk about structure and organization. So in this case, we are going to start from a very tiny, kind of the smallest level, all the way up to the largest level. So there's 6 different levels that we're going to talk about. And the very first one is chemical. So this is our smallest level. At this level, we're talking about atoms, chemical bonds, molecules, really small stuff, protons and electrons, water molecules, oxygen, really small stuff. But these are our building blocks. So a step up from the chemical level is the cellular level. So our cell is a basic unit of life. So chemical is the smallest level, but our second level, the cellular level, this is where our actual basic unit of life occurs. The stuff at the chemical level, while it exists, it is not life. The cellular level is where life actually begins. Cells are made up of compartments and organelles, such as mitochondria and nuclei, or a nucleus. There are more examples of organelles. I'm sure you guys, if you've taken biology or anatomy in high school, are familiar with organelles. Moving up one more level, we're going to talk about tissues. So these are a group of cells that have a similar structure and function. So one concept to introduce here, since the words pop up, is that structure determines function. So pretty much any cell or system or organ or anything in our body, its structure or how it's designed is directly related to the function it performs. So that'll come up a few different times throughout the semester. So back on track. So the tissues are our third level, and it's a group of cells with similar structure and function, and it also includes the extracellular substances they release. So there's 4 broad types of tissues. We'll have a whole chapter on tissues where we will dive into the differences in these types, but for now, just know there's 4 broad types: epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous tissue. Okay, moving up one more, we have organs. So this builds up even more. Now we have 2 or more types of tissues that are going to act together to perform a common function or functions. So different examples are the stomach, the heart, the liver, the ovary, the bladder, the kidney. That's not an exhaustive list. There's many more organs in the body. And so in our example here, you see the bladder. And so you see it has epithelium or epithelial tissue, connective tissue, as well as muscle tissue. So that's 3 different types of tissue, but they're all working as part of the urinary system. So individually, they are tissues. Together, they make up an organ, in this case, the bladder. All right, building up even further, we're going to talk about organ systems. So now we're at level 5. And so this is now going to be groups of organs contributing to some common function. So we just used the bladder as our organ example in our last level at level 4. Now we're going to look at the whole urinary system. So that also includes our kidneys, our ureters, and our bladder. Some other examples would be our digestive system. You have your reproductive system. You have your nervous system. So there's a multitude of different systems, and we'll highlight those a little bit further on in this lecture. And then finally, all the way up at level 6, our highest level is an organism. So all of our organ systems work together to allow us to function as an organism. And this organism, even though now we're talking about kind of big picture, it also includes all our associated microorganisms. One example of this is our intestinal bacteria or our gut biome. So when we talk about an organism, we're talking about all the different parts that make it up functioning. All right, this slide just kind of puts it all together and gives a little bit of a gradual pathway. So we talked about the smallest level, level 1 being the chemical level. We move to the cellular level. This is where we have our basic unit of life, the cell. Moving up, put a lot of similar cells together, and you're then going to get a tissue. So you'll see the theme is that it keeps building on top of each other. So we put different types of tissues, 2 or more different types of tissues together to create an organ. We put multiple organs together to do a job. That creates an organ system. And then all of our organ systems working together makes up the organism. So level 6 is our highest level of organism. Okay, as I said, we're going to highlight the different organ systems. A majority of these systems have their own chapter dedicated to it completely. So we're not going to go in depth at all. This is just an introduction into the fact that they exist and just a brief highlight of their primary function. So don't try to memorize word for word definitions or memorize every single part to each system that are labeled here, because that is not necessary right now. Okay, our integumentary system. This is also known as our skin, but it includes our hair and our nails as well. It provides protection, helps us regulate temperature, it helps regulate water loss, produces vitamin D. Our skeletal system, it's not only protective of our organs, but it provides support, it gives our body structure. Those are kind of the obvious ones, but it also helps in balance of different substances such as calcium. It can help with our pH balance. And it obviously helps with movement, considering it makes up a lot of our joints. The muscular system itself, this is another one that's a little bit obvious in terms of its primary job. It's mainly moving us. It helps us maintain our posture. So our muscular system is always working, even if we're just sitting still. It helps hold us upright. And it also... Sorry, guys, that's Ali going crazy again. All right, our nervous system. This is how our brain sends signals and receives signals from the rest of our body. We have our endocrine system. This is another regulatory system. This is where a lot of our hormones are produced and released. So the hormonal signaling is a large part of our endocrine system. That also helps us maintain homeostasis, which is a topic we'll introduce here soon. Our cardiovascular system, this is our heart and our blood vessels. So of course, this is providing nutrients and oxygen throughout the body. We have our lymphatic system. This one is a little less intuitive or talked about for some of you if you haven't heard of the lymphatic system. It has a lot to do with our immune system. It helps us filter and cycle some of our blood that's returning to the heart, helps us with fluid balance, digestion, and different nutrient absorption. So it kind of works hand in hand with our circulatory system or our cardiovascular system. The respiratory system, that's where we're going to talk about our breathing. So of course the lungs are a big part of that, but there's also multiple structures kind of from head to the lungs that are important as well. The digestive system, all the way from our mouth to our anus. So this is how we obviously eat our food. how we absorb nutrients and digest those, and how we get rid of waste, similar to the urinary system. That is how we are going to process fluids. It helps us filter our blood, helps with fluid balance, electrolyte balance, pH balance. We hopefully are keeping the good stuff that we need and getting rid of stuff that we have in excess. And then finally, the male and female reproductive systems. So these are all the components that contribute to us reproducing between male and female. So like I said, I know that was a relatively quick overview. Don't feel like you need to memorize every single piece of each system. You should understand right now the general function or the main function of each system, but there's no need to know anything in depth because we'll cover these in depth further down the line. Okay, we're going to move on now to discussing the different characteristics of life. So there are 6 different characteristics that we're going to talk about here. The first of which is organization. So let me backtrack for just 1 second. So we already talked about human organism being the highest level when we talked about our structure map there. So an organism is any living thing that's composed of at least one cell that meets all these characteristic of life criteria. So any organism is going to meet these 6 criteria, even if it's something as basic as a single-celled bacteria or something as complex as a human. So the first one we'll talk about is organization. So this refers specifically to the interrelationships between parts of an organism. So these parts interact to perform specific functions. Living things are very organized. And so our cellular function all the way up to our organ system function is dependent on our cells and on everything being extremely organized. Metabolism is our second characteristic. Metabolism is the sum of all of our chemical and physical changes. So it's the good and the bad, the stuff going in and the stuff going out. So our metabolism allows us to use energy to perform vital functions like growth and movement and reproduction. And as a part of metabolism, we have the ability to intake food and turn that into energy. Our third one is responsiveness, and that's our ability to sense changes in both the external and internal environments. So not only do we need to be able to sense what's going on around us and what's changing around us, we also need to be able to respond to changes in our internal environment. We are going to talk about in the next section the concept of homeostasis, which is more or less means maintaining our internal environment. So we'll talk about this a little bit further. Our fourth characteristic is growth. Organisms should be able to increase in size. This includes increasing cell size, creating more cells or groups of cells, and being able to produce more extracellular material. An example of this would be when bones grow, they continue to multiply and have more bone cells. Number 5 is development, and this has kind of 2 parts to it. We have changes in both form and changes in size. So what kind of sets development apart from growth is that it's a change in form and this concept of differentiation. So differentiation is changes to a cell's structure and function from an immature cell to a mature cell that has a specific job. So an example of this is starting as a stem cell or a cell that can really be anything, and then it differentiates into, say, a muscle cell. So that process of going from a stem cell to a muscle cell is differentiation. Our last characteristic of life is reproduction. So this means that an organism needs to be able to form new cells or new organisms completely. This allows us to generate new individuals, of course, to prevent extinction. But this also allows us on a smaller cellular level to repair our tissues. There are certain tissues in the body, such as certain nerve cells in the brain, that are unable to regenerate or reproduce, and therefore we can't repair them. So in order for a tissue to be able to be repaired, reproduction has to be able to take place. Okay, as I said, we're going to talk about homeostasis, and we talk about this in relation to maintaining our internal environment. So homeostasis is maintenance of a constant internal environment despite fluctuations in the external or internal environment. So our body is quite picky. It likes to be at a very specific temperature, a specific pH, it wants a specific balance of nutrients. Our body is like a fine-tuned machine. It has to be running exactly so, or else things start to break down. So we have to constantly make adjustments because we don't stay the same all the time. Our external environment changes and our internal environment changes. So our body has to have systems in place that helps to adjust to these changes so that we maintain what's known as our set point, or those conditions where our body is able to function properly. So variables are the different body properties that could change. So these variables are all different pieces of our total homeostasis that can change. So example, body temperature, our heart rate, our blood pressure, our blood glucose levels, our blood cell count, and our respiratory rate. So we'll talk about body temperature as our main example because that is typically the easiest to understand for people. So as I said, our body wants to function in a normal range. So this is the normal extent of increase or decrease around a set point. Our set point is our normal number or our average value of a specific variable. So as I said, we'll talk about temperature as our example. So our set point is 98.6. That's the average or the norm. We want to be exactly at 98.6. So even though 98.6 is our set point, our bodies can handle a little bit of fluctuation. So it's okay if we're at 98.4, and it's okay if we're at 98.8. So that's our normal range, and then our 98.6 is our set point. So set points for some variables can temporarily adjust depending on how our body needs to function. So one example of this is body temperature. Our set point may change due to a fever, and we purposely want to elevate our body to get rid of whatever is causing the fever. Another example is our heart rate and blood pressure and respiratory rate. If we're exercising, that's going to change because it needs to support our higher level of activity. That's not a bad thing. We don't necessarily want to counteract that. So that's certain examples where that set point may change so that our body doesn't respond in the same way. So in order to maintain homeostasis, our body needs feedback. And how it gets that is primarily through this pathway. So we have receptors in various parts of the bodies. So for our example of temperature, say we have temperature receptor in our skin. That's our receptor. So it's going to detect a change in our external and internal temperature. The control center. Typically, we're thinking of this as the brain in some capacity, not always, but you can think of our control center as the brain or what's in charge. It's going to receive the signal from the receptor. It then kind of has to interpret what that signal means It's going to establish a set point or refer to the set point, and then it's going to send a signal to the effector. So the effector is what actually causes a change in the variable. So let's go through this example with temperature again. So our temperature receptor in our skin detects that it got colder outside. It tells our brain, hey, it's colder now. Our brain says, yep, that's below our set point enough to respond. And so it's going to send a signal to our muscle cells out there where the change happened and say, hey, you should start shivering to bring that temperature back up. So there's two types of feedback. There's negative feedback, which is the type of feedback that is used in the example we just talked about with temperature. And there's positive feedback. So negative feedback by far is the most common type of feedback. And we call it negative feedback because it's going to be a reversal of whatever deviation is happening. So detection is the deviation going away from the set point. So our temperature receptor in the skin detects that it's getting colder than our set point of 98.6. So the control center is going to send a correction saying we need to heat back up. So it's an opposite of the change that was detected. We detected a decrease in temperature. We corrected with an action to cause an increase in temperature. So typically with homeostasis, when a change happens, we want to enact something to do the opposite to bring us back within the average. So if something goes up, we want to bring it back down. If something goes down, we want to bring it back up. So this is a really important concept. So if you don't understand the concept of negative feedback, then I really need you to reach out to me because this is probably the most important concept in this chapter. Okay, we just talked about this example, but take a look in your book if you'd like to go through that temperature example again. And I guess the one good thing about this example is it shows that once sweating brings the temperature back down in this case, and the set point is restored, the sweating stops. So let's go through this actually. We talked about an example above about increasing temperature. This case, the body is sensing an increase in temperature. The brain says, okay, that's above our set point, so let's sweat so we can bring the temperature back down. Once it gets back to the set point, that signal to keep sweating and cool down stops. So that's negative feedback. Temperature was going up, so we sweat to bring it back down. So positive feedback is the other type of feedback. This typically does not occur, and you can think of this as a stack on one another. So the initial stimulus causes an increase in stimulus and amplifies the response. So instead of opposing the response, now the response is going to be amplified. So there's only a couple examples of this in normal conditions. Sometimes there's some abnormal positive feedback associated with injury or disease. But the two most common examples where positive feedback is a good thing is childbirth and blood clotting. So 99% of the time, homeostasis is going to be maintained with negative feedback. But there's a few key instances where a positive feedback loop is going to come into play. Okay, so let's go to our positive feedback example. So remember, we're going to amplify the response this time. So we're going to use the example of childbirth. So when contractions start, the uterus is stretched more, and the brain receives that signal and causes the release of oxytocin. Oxytocin then causes stronger contractions, which causes increased uterine stretch, which causes more oxytocin to be released. So you see that that response is amplified. The more that the uterus stretches, the more oxytocin is released. But the more oxytocin is released, the more the contraction is stronger and the more it stretches, which causes oxytocin to keep being released. So in this case, it happens so that kind of the childbirth process continues and the mother is able to have the baby. But we're amplifying the response. If this was a negative feedback loop, when oxytocin was released, then there would be less contraction of the uterus so that less oxytocin was released. So it would oppose the response. In this case, we're amplifying the response. Again, even though these aren't seen as common, I want you to really understand the difference between negative and positive. So please reach out to me if that is a confusing concept. Okay, we're going to kind of switch gears and start talking about some different terminology and just how we talk about the body in terms of directional terms and some other terms in terms of just how we classify things and how we discuss the body. So the first thing to know is the anatomical position. So the anatomical position is standing erect with both face and palms forward. So the palms and arms are what we would consider a supinated position. If our palms were down, you can see the back of our hands, that would be a pronated position. But anatomical position, the arms are in supine. They're showing the palms. And so let's talk about some of the different directional terms of the body. So this one shows a little bit of all of them. We're going to break it down just a little bit more. Okay, superior is above, inferior is below, anterior is the front, posterior is the back. These are interchangeable with the terms ventral and dorsal. In four-legged animals, ventral means belly, but in humans and people that stand erect, it also means the front. Dorsal means the back. So in an animal, it's the top, or a dorsal fin is a good example. And someone standing erect, it's the same as posterior. Two words that you do not see on here, but you may see at times is cephalic is the same as superior, meaning towards the head, and caudal, C-A-U-D-A-L, is the same as inferior, meaning towards the tail. A couple other terms, we have medial and lateral. So medial and lateral refer specifically to the midline. So medial meaning closer to the midline, lateral meaning farther away from the midline. Proximal and distal. So proximal is closer to the point of attachment. Distal is farther from the point of attachment. When we're talking about superficial and deep, we're talking about towards the surface, and deep meaning towards the interior of the body. That's not front and back. Superficial and deep are not front and back. They are towards the surface and towards the interior. So here is a graphic that shows all of them. This is a good time to highlight, this is a good time to go ahead and highlight the fact that we don't use the directional terms individually. So I can't just say the head is superior. When we use the directional terms, it tends to be comparison of two regions. So one example, the head is superior to the neck. I can't just say the head is superior. The head is superior to the neck, or the neck is inferior to the head. The umbilicus or belly button is medial to the arm. The arm is lateral to the umbilicus. The shoulder is proximal to the wrist. The wrist is distal to the shoulder. The chest is anterior to the scapula or the shoulder blade. And then in terms of superficial and deep, the skin is superficial to the heart, or the heart is deep to the skin. So remember, those are comparison terms. So those should not just, you should have two regions being compared. All right, we break our body into a few different regions. So the upper limbs include the upper arm. And so basically the way this is broken down is kind of a subgrouping. So the upper limb is the main heading. And then it can be broken down further into the upper arm, the forearm, the wrist, and the hand. Our lower limb can be broken down into the thigh, the lower leg, the ankle, and the foot. And then if we're discussing our central region, that's the head, the neck, and the trunk. So I know there's a lot of different terms here. These are found on page 22 and 23 of the textbook as well. But this shows kind of our major groupings in terms of the head, neck, trunk, upper limb, lower limb, and then the subgroupings as well. So I don't necessarily expect you to memorize every single one of these, but you should familiarize yourself with these different regions and body parts, because as you go through future classes, these are words that you're going to see a lot and need to know. So you might as well learn it now and start building that knowledge. Like I said, I don't expect you to memorize every single one, but at least try to get yourself familiar with stuff. They have a general idea where they go. And if there's some specific, really important regions, I'll make sure I highlight those for you guys prior to quizzes and tests if I can. All right, so we were just looking at all the names for the different regions of the body. This is specific to our abdomen. So there's two different ways that they break this down. This left one here, quadrants, this is what you'll hear most often in a hospital or a doctor's office setting. They talk about the abdomen in 4 different quadrants. You have right upper and lower and left upper and lower. And the reason they break them into these quadrants is because certain organs are located in certain areas, and certain pathologies are associated with tenderness or specific findings in a specific quadrant. There's a lot going on in the abdomen. So discussing it in quadrants is a way to be a little bit more specific and help everyone narrow in on what we're talking about. The regions is a more advanced breakdown or a more specific breakdown. So you see we have the epigastric region, the umbilical region, and the hypogastric region in the center. Up top here, we have the right hypochondriac and the left hypochondriac. And then down low, we have the right iliac and left iliac. And then in the middle, we have our right and left lumbar regions. So these aren't used quite as often in the medical field, partly because a lot of organs are big enough that they kind of fit in a quadrant, but they definitely go across multiple regions. And this is just a little bit more straightforward. But just know they both exist and kind of remember which one's quadrant, remember quad 4, and which one's your regions. All right, now we're going to talk about the actual planes of the body. And so this is different ways that we can divide the body more or less. So the first one we'll talk about is the sagittal plane. That's this vertical one here. And so if we go through the middle there, we can divide into right and left parts or sides. So think sagittal sides. So a median plane or a mid-sagittal plane is a vertical or sagittal plane that's directly in the middle. So we could draw our sagittal plane vertically anywhere, but it's a median plane or a mid-sagittal plane if it goes directly down the middle. Our transverse plane, also known as a horizontal plane, goes straight across the middle here, and it separates into superior and inferior. So think transverse, top, and bottom. And then our frontal plane, this is a vertical plane in the opposite direction, and the frontal is going to separate into anterior and posterior, think front and back. So sagittal, side to side, it's going to be right and left. Transverse, top and bottom, it's going to be superior and inferior parts, and frontal, front and back, it's going to be anterior, posterior. All right, home stretch here, guys. We're going to talk about body cavities. So we talk about these as dorsal and ventral, or front and back. That's our two kind of first breakdown in terms of organization. So let's discuss dorsal first. So dorsal body cavity, this is our posterior cavity, and it encloses the organs of our nervous system. So we can break this down further into the cranial cavity, which contains the brain, and the vertebral canal, which contains the spinal cord. So the stuff in green here, that's our dorsal cavity. The ventral cavity, this is our stuff in purple here, as well as red, so this front half. So this has a majority of our internal organs. Another word for organ is viscera. You'll see that term comes into play in the next couple slides. So we divide this one a little more than the dorsal cavity. So we break it down into the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity. So the dividing line between our thoracic cavity and our abdominal pelvic cavity is our diaphragm, which is our breathing muscle. So we can go further in the abdominopelvic cavity. So the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, kind of named that way, makes sense. Okay, focusing in on the superior cavity of the ventral cavity is the thoracic cavity. So this is the space within our chest wall, and then, like I said, the dividing line is the diaphragm. Our heart, our lungs, our thymus gland, our esophagus, and our trachea are all located within the thoracic cavity. The mediastinum here is the space between the lungs, and this is where our heart itself sits. The inferior cavities, we have our abdominal cavities, which is between our diaphragm and our pelvis. That's where our stomach, intestines, liver, spleen, pancreas, and kidneys are all located. And then the pelvic cavity is the space within the pelvis itself. That's where our urinary bladder, our reproductive organs, and some of our large intestine extends into the pelvic cavity. All right, last slide, last concept for chapter 1. I know it's a lot to start with. Is our serous membrane. So we'll talk about this multiple times throughout the semester when we dive into our specific organ systems. But what a serous membrane is, it's a membrane that lines the trunk cavities. It covers the organs in our ventral body cavity. So our lungs, our heart, multiple organs have these serous membranes on it. So remember above we said that viscera is another word for organs. So the visceral serous membrane is going to be the membrane that covers the organ. The parietal serous membrane is going to line the wall of the cavity itself. Cavity just meaning a fluid-filled space between the membrane. So if you look here, we have that example of an outer balloon wall with an inner balloon wall. There's a cavity between the outer and inner balloon, and our fist is contained within that inner balloon wall. That's kind of like our organ. So now if we talk about the lungs are our fist in this example. So our lungs are the organ. The lungs are covered by a visceral serous membrane directly on the lung surface. The parietal serous membrane lines the thoracic cavity, and then, or this outer balloon wall, and then we have a cavity between the visceral membrane and the parietal membrane that contains fluid. Remember, visceral membrane is always going to be directly on the organ. That's the easiest way to remember it. Okay, that wraps up chapter 1. Like I said, please make sure to go through all your book readings and activities. Please check your announcements frequently. I will try to communicate often and keep you guys updated on what you need to be paying attention to for the week. I hope you guys have a great semester, and we will move on to chapter 2 next.